Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, to accommodate the senator from Utah, I will not make my remarks first, just by way of introduction, to say that tonight at midnight, American national security is going to be irreversibly weakened by the actions of President Trump and his administration, because at midnight, the administration will allow the online publication of blueprints to manufacture 3D manufacturing of plastic guns, and this is one example. So to accommodate the senator from Utah, instead of making my remarks now, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 3304, submitted earlier today, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I first saw this legislation literally moments ago, and therefore haven't had adequate time to review it. But I will say this. Any legislation that comes forth from this body that begins with the following words will attract my attention and should attract the attention of anyone who's concerned about our First Amendment and other constitutional rights. It begins with the words, "It shall be unlawful for any person to intentionally publish." That ought to be concerning to us, to each and every one of us, Democrats and Republicans alike. On that basis, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, the senator is basing that on First Amendment rights. Mr. President, there are many limits on our First Amendment rights of speech. You cannot say fire in a crowded theater. Why in the world would you assert First Amendment rights to publish instructions to do a plastic gun that someone could take through a metal detector into a crowded theater and start shooting in that theater instead of shouting fire, which is clearly an understood limitation upon our First Amendment rights of speech. And it's inexplicable that the administration is allowing this to go into effect at midnight tonight. It's dangerous. In fact, the president this morning tweeted that allowing these blueprints to go online, the president tweeted, quote, "It doesn't seem to make sense," end of quote. I would say amen to that, Mr. President, but it's your administration that has allowed this to happen, because after years of winning this issue in courts, at every stage of litigation, the administration has surrendered to the crazed demands of a self-described anarchist who is going to put this up on the internet. He wants to sow chaos, he said so, in our country and across the world by making these blueprints widely available. And we can allow this. We can make this impossible if, number one, the president would do it, and he'd stop it before midnight, and the clock is ticking, and we're only talking less than 9 hours from now, because these 3D printed guns made of plastic or rosin can't be detected by metal detectors. And because they're plastic, there's not a serial number on the metal, so they're untraceable. And anyone can get their hands on them, even people who are legally barred from having a gun, like felons or domestic abusers. So after midnight, people could walk onto airplanes with a deadly weapon because they're not caught in the metal detector, and people would not know about it. People could walk into schools My state is the most recent of a school shooting. As a result of Parkland, people are outraged. They want to harden schools. But now, are we going to render the metal detectors useless as they try to harden the schools? Because somebody can get through a metal detector with this or with an AK-47 or an AR-15 that can be manufactured by these 3D printers? Mr. President, somebody could come into this building. Somebody could be up in that gallery right now if they have a plastic gun, including the bullets that are plastic bullets, and we wouldn't know about it. And so whether you're talking about schools or this chamber, or we're talking about airports, any public space that we try to protect, it's going to be useless because these 3D printed firearms are a direct threat to our national security, and we're going to let these go up on the internet tonight at midnight? I'd think that some of our allies, like the Israelis, should be concerned about this, because this is not limited to the United States. These could be printed anywhere in the world, and therefore it can give national security apparatuses a great, great headache because they can't detect them. And so, as I stated in the unanimous consent request, I and other senators have introduced the legislation today to block the online publication of blueprints. Now, as it turns out, since we can't do it here, and if the president can't do it in 8 hours and 45 minutes, it's going on upline, it's going to take us a long time. I mean, what senator or representative can object to this? And so even if we can get the legislation passed, it's going to take a while because the legislative process is slow. We've also introduced a separate bill to require every gun to have a serial number and to have a main component made of metal so that it would be detected by the metal detector. And obviously, this is all common sense. This is not a partisan issue. Everybody should be concerned about this threat posed by these deadly plastic guns. And Mr. President, I had intended to give these remarks before asking for unanimous consent as an accommodation to the senator from Utah who had to run to an appointment. I went ahead and asked that unanimous consent, but I want my fellow senators who have been so great and so articulate on this issue, I want them to be heard, and I'd ask for them to also speak why the senator from Utah's objection was about First Amendment rights, why those objections don't apply here. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I want to thank my colleague and friend from Florida for his leadership on this profoundly important and imminently threatening issue of public safety, and as well my colleague from New Jersey for his very important leadership, also Senator Markey of Massachusetts. We have joined together in this cause to prevent a new wave of lethal gun violence in our streets and communities resulting from these plastic, undetectable, and untraceable weapons. We're talking about assault rifles, pistols, shotguns, all of them homemade. They are ghost guns. They are the new frontier and new face of gun violence in this country. Our colleague from Utah raised a First Amendment objection. The fact is that the courts are dealing with that objective. It is the basis of a challenge brought by a group that so far has failed in the courts to stop this public health regulation. No right is absolute. The First Amendment is not absolute. The idea of crying fire in a movie house is one example that is given again and again. But likewise, in the course of our history, we have found that the First Amendment has to yield to public safety when there is an imminent and urgent threat. Clearly, there is here. I have supported companion legislation that would, in fact, stop the actual making of these kinds of weapons. It involves none of the First Amendment difficulties that the senator from Utah has raised, and I will be pursuing it, perhaps through the same kind of unanimous consent effort in the days to come. But today, the senator from Florida is absolutely right to seek this body's unanimous consent in the face of this threat that is self-inflicted by the Trump administration. It has caved to the right-wing fringe group and the NRA that are challenging this public safety regulation, and it has in effect snatched defeat from the jaws of victory because the litigation was on a path to prevailing against those objections. This litigation should have been permitted to run its course. It was on a path to success. But now the administration has created this emergency beginning at midnight tonight, because on August 1st, plans, designs, blueprints can be published without limit on the internet, making possible the mass homemade manufacture of these ghost guns. They are a scourge, a potential source of death and injury on our streets. Any idea that plastic is less durable or strong as a source of material for these guns is completely outmoded, because we make planes from plastic. Plastic in some forms is as durable and strong as metal. So the threat here is real and urgent, and I join my colleague from Florida in asking that there be unanimous consent, and I hope that we will pursue this legislative effort together and that we will have bipartisan support. I stress, we must have bipartisan support. Senators who fail to step up and speak out and act in the face of this emergency should be held accountable. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor to our colleague from New Jersey.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I join my colleagues on the floor, and I want to salute both Senator Nelson and Senator Blumenthal, who represent states whose citizens have felt the scourge of gun violence. In Newtown and Parkland and the Pulse nightclub. I don't know how many more Parklands we need, but I certainly know that my colleague from Utah, who only read part about what alarms him, that it shall not be possible to publish what? To publish the ability to create a gun that is undetectable and untraceable. Why are we spending billions as we go through the airports of our country to ultimately secure ourselves? We saw it after September 11th. And now we're going to undermine all of those billions and all of those securities by allowing anyone here or in the world to get access to the IP address that you downloaded, and all of a sudden you can create a three-dimensional plastic gun that is as deadly as any other gun. And what draws us to the floor to ask the unusual effort of unanimous consent to ultimately bring this legislation to the floor is the failure of the administration in the first place. not to allow this to happen. We don't need legislation if the president turns back the decisions of his Secretary of State and others in his administration and says, hey, wait, this is not in our national security interest. It is not in the national interests of the United States to allow our citizens to be exposed to an undetectable, untraceable gun as deadly as any other. It's not in the national interest and security of the United States to have our soldiers halfway around the world have terrorists have access to a new design that will be cheaper for them and at the end of the day will allow them to attack our soldiers. It is unconscionable. But since the administration doesn't seem to be acting, if anything, they've acted the opposite way, that's why we come to the floor. If the government has any specific role that rises above all other, it's to protect its citizens. That's what we're trying to do here. It should be a bipartisan request. And what's so difficult about the legislation? Nothing much. One of the two pieces of legislation simply says you cannot permit an IP address to be published on the internet because then globally anybody can get that downloaded and create a gun. That's the simple part of that. The other one is that any gun has to be traceable and identifiable and therefore has to have a number on it. Even when our colleagues who are the most ardent advocates of the Second Amendment say they don't want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, well, how do you keep a gun out of the hand of a criminal who doesn't have it detectable and isn't traceable? It's pretty amazing. Now, I've been in the Congress 26 years between the House and the Senate. This is one of the most amazing moments for me. Look, this country has a gun violence problem. It has a mass shooting problem. But do-it-yourself downloadable guns will supercharge this crisis, leading to more senseless tragedies. It's already too easy for criminals and extremists and terrorists to get their hands on a gun. And now we're going to add a new concern, terrorists packing the plans for new plastic printable firearms. Look, I don't care if a gun is made out of metal, if it's made out of plastic, if it can fire a bullet and take someone's life, then it should be regulated. It's beyond irresponsible for the Trump administration to roll over and allow a self-described anarchist to post directions for do-it-yourself guns on a website available to anyone with an internet connection. That's what we're saying here. Already, according to some news reports, the blueprints from an AR-15, the weapon used in the massacre at Parkland, were downloaded more than 2,500 times. That's 2,500 unknown individuals in an unregulated space. Now, as the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was appalled to find out that the State Department carried this out without notifying Congress. Last Wednesday, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was before our committee, and he looked us in the eye, said he was unaware of the issue and that he would look into it. That was a Wednesday. On Friday, the State Department had suspended arms export regulations specifically to allow these 3D gun blueprints to be posted on the internet. Well, so much for looking into it. This was a case that was proceeding to the courts where the government had won at every round. And in this morning's tweet, the president made it pretty clear that instead of listening to the concerns of the American people when he has a gun question, which I would submit is not even a question of a gun question, it's a national security question, he listens to the NRA. Now, the NRA may be concerned in this particular case. Why? Because plastic guns don't get built by gun manufacturers and dealers that they represent and fund their causes. The posting of a 3D gun shows just how dangerous the Trump administration's regulatory effort to loosen export controls on firearms, including assault-style rifles and even sniper rifles, actually is to the safety of Americans at home, abroad, and innocent civilians across the globe. All you have to do is go to this company's website to see it for yourself. They're proclaiming, quote, "The era of the downloadable gun is here." That's what they say on their website. The era of the downloadable gun is here. Well, we should make sure that that era doesn't happen. These are two simple but powerful, common sense pieces of legislation that can protect us. I call upon the President to stop it dead in its tracks so we don't have to wait for the legislation. But if not, we call upon this institution to protect the American people. And I hope my colleague will consider coming back later in the day and making another unanimous consent request so that we can actually protect the American people against the ability of anyone with a 3D printer to go ahead, create a gun that can kill a human being, and ultimately defy all of our security procedures at airports and elsewhere, and let any terrorist in the world who wishes us harm to do it and manufacture it in quantity. That's pretty outrageous. That's what we're talking about. I hope the administration will see the light and change the course. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Delaware. Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the senator from Florida, Mr. Nelson, for introducing this legislation, and my other colleagues who have been on the Senate floor today. And this is emergency legislation, which is why there was a request for unanimous consent to move forward today. And it's very disturbing that that consent was not provided, because we know that as a result of the Trump administration's actions, starting tomorrow, people all over the country, and in fact all over the world, are going to be able to download on their computers instructions and a whole manual as to how to manufacture plastic guns with 3D printing. Now, this is something that has been before previous administrations. The Obama administration fought hard against this ability for people to be able to send at the speed of light those instructions to make 3D guns around the world. In fact, this administration early on opposed allowing this to happen. But somehow, when this whole lawsuit was resolved the other day, the folks who want to send these instructions around the world were allowed to do so. In fact, Alan Gottlieb, who's with the Second Amendment Foundation, that was part of this case, said, quote, "We asked for the moon and we figured the government would reject it, but they didn't want to go to trial. The government fought us all the way and then all of a sudden folded their tent." Mr. President, Secretary Pompeo, the Trump administration folded their tent, and as a consequence, Americans will be placed at much higher risk starting tomorrow. We've already seen over 1,000 people sign up to begin to receive the instructions to make AR-15s using 3D printing. Why is this going to pose a big danger? Number one, it is a total end run around criminal background checks for the purchase of a handgun or any kind of weapon. We should be closing the loopholes in the existing background check system, closing things like the gun show loophole. Instead, this just allows for a total runaround. If you can just download instructions and use a 3D printer to make a gun at home, you obviously aren't going to go through any kind of criminal background check. Number two, we have spent a lot of time and effort giving the ATF the authority to track guns used in crimes. I would have thought all of us want to make sure that people who are using guns to commit crimes, that we can track them down and catch them. But if you print a gun at home using a 3D printer, there's no traceable number, there's no serial number. So we're not going to be able to track down easily the people who are using these guns to commit crimes. And third, with plastic 3D printing, the technology we have at airports to detect metal will become ineffective. So folks around the world, if you're a terrorist wanting to do harm, now you're going to get instructions over the internet. You're going to be able to download it as easy as you can download an iTunes. And with the 3D printer in your basement or around the corner in some space, you're going to be able to manufacture guns. So evading metal detectors at airports, putting the entire flying public at risk. Number two, a complete end run around the criminal background system, which is already flawed. And number three, not allowing us to trace guns used in crime. I thought that there was a consensus in this body that we should get after people who use guns to commit crimes, whether crimes here in the United States or crimes around the world. And yet, what this body's doing by not allowing a vote today on the Nelson bill is saying it's okay. It's okay for people to be using this technology in their basements to make guns that can evade all these systems and commit crimes and make it impossible to trace who did it. This is a really, really bad day for the United States Senate. This is a moment where people should be acting in an emergency fashion to stop this danger and risk to the American public. And instead, people are just folding up their tent and allowing this to happen starting tomorrow. It's a shameful moment.